Welcome back. We are live from Vienna at the IFC Climate Business Forum, now on its 5th edition and about to wrap up. My name is Giulia Braga. I'm Program Manager of the Connect4Climate initiative of the World Bank Group, and I'm very pleased to have here with me today Mr. Hans-Peter Lankes, IFC Vice President of Economics and Private Sector Development. Welcome, Hans-Peter. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Giulia.
I know you're just back from the annual meetings in Bali, and we're really very pleased to have you here with us today. Over the past 2 days, actually, here at the forum, there was a strong focus on the need for strong public-private partnerships and cooperation in order to tackle climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about what the IFC is doing in these regards?
Yeah, this is a very good point that you raise. IFC has traditionally worked purely with the private sector and has worked in a sort of reactive way. Potential investors would come to the IFC and say, hey, I have a project opportunity here, but it's a very complicated environment in a developing country in which the institutions are not very strong, and we have some difficulties finding funding, and so would you come with us and fund this? Now, that has worked well over the decades, but now we have a very different task. Now we have a huge need to invest in order to meet the SDGs, but also to meet climate objectives. We're all aware of that. We're far behind what needs to be done in order to prevent climate change of catastrophic proportions. We need to bring the private sector into that picture, and for that we have to also lead the private sector or create the opportunities for the private sector to invest. It is not enough to wait for investors to come forward with an idea. You have to create these ideas, and for that, in many countries, you have to work with the public sector in order to create the framework to push the envelope on opportunities for the private sector. So for instance, if you talk about renewable energies, most countries do not have very strong frameworks for investment in renewable energies. Everything that's required, from land acquisition to the legal rules governing that, the offtake agreements that you need, the certainties around that, the way that the grid handles renewable energy, those are things in which the public sector needs to be strengthened, in which it has to take certain steps. And for that, we as the World Bank Group, IFC, World Bank, need to work with the public sector in order to create the conditions for the private sector. So that is the public-private approach that we are taking in the climate area. And I could give you many examples in other areas of relevance to the climate where that is the case.
So it's very much learning from each other, right, and engaging in a positive exchange between the public and private sector to find innovative solutions. Actually, I would like to ask you also about the IPCC report that was released on October 8th. And it's quite worrisome in some senses, because it really highlights the need to act now and for countries to really take on climate action and implement the Paris Agreement as soon as possible. It worries about the catastrophic impacts that we will face if action is not taken. Today the summit was all about solutions though. So I'm asking you, can you share a little bit of examples of solutions that the IFC is undertaking?
Yes, you're right. That report reinforced the sense of urgency that we should all have. We all knew that, of course, that climate change was going to potentially have catastrophic effects. But the evidence that now begins to pile up, and this is what the IPCC report shows, is even worse than what we had thought. So we have very little time, and we have to be even more ambitious than what we believed we had to be. So in order to be able to get there, we have to take much more ambitious action in a short time frame. How do we get there? As I mentioned, the private sector will have to play a very significant role. The public sector just simply does not have the funds necessary to make all the investments that are required here in infrastructure, but also in all walks of life, really, in which we have to adjust the way we work, the way that societies really function in order to be consistent with climate objectives. Now, how do we get this big step up that is needed? There, IFC and others have, in the past few years, been coming up with new solutions to draw capital into investments, especially, of course, in emerging markets. That is our job. Institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies are not traditionally taking high risks. So you don't see much institutional money going into emerging markets. You don't see much of it going into climate areas. These are perceived to be risky. So IFC has designed some ways in which you can combine different sources of funding, more patient, more risk-friendly sources of funding with such institutional funds in order to make it less risky for them to invest. So those kinds of schemes are absolutely crucial because that is where the big money sits that we need to make to work
Absolutely.
for climate change, mitigation and adaptation. So IFC has created certain, we call them platforms, to be able to channel institutional money. It has also created new bond categories, or it has helped with others to create green bond markets, not only issuing green bonds, which now multilateral development institutions have been doing for a few years, but also to create the ability of financial institutions in emerging markets to issue such bonds and to create demand and supply for these bonds. So in the past few months, IFC, together with others and with implementation by Amundi, which is a large asset manager, has created a kind of market in which there are institutional funds which represent the demand side, but also bonds issued by financial institutions in emerging markets. So these institutional funds buy these bonds, and we are sitting at both sides of the market. That and a variety of other schemes are ways in which we hope to get to leverage up the size of what we're doing.
Fantastic. It's really great what you're doing and inspirational as well. May I ask you a little different question from a different angle? So Connect4Climate is a climate change communication program. And of course, when we think about the private sector, as much as companies should be offering climate-friendly products in the future, there is a need for consumers to demand such products. So what do you think is the role of communication in really encouraging people to change behavior and to act on climate change?
That is a very interesting question. I think, well, communication is the way that we can have a big impact on the way people perceive their world and in which they perceive the challenges. So yes, communication has to be crucial. In so many ways, we have to change what we do in the small, at home and at work and collectively or individually. So if it comes, for instance, to, if you look at the agricultural value chain, which taking everything together from land use to agro-processing accounts for some 45% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Well, a lot of the agricultural value chain is driven by people's behaviors, by their preferences. So meat, as we know, is much more intensive in greenhouse gas emissions. It is more intensive in water. It has sort of a big footprint on the climate. To the extent that we can change habits and tastes through communication, by just bringing it home to everyone, how their individual behaviors can have an impact on the global climate, we are going to be more successful. So it is not just something, climate mitigation is not just something that governments decide. It's not just something that companies may invest in. It is also something that every one of us has to live in the way that we interact with nature.
Absolutely, and to link to this, I know you have children, and I would like to ask you, what's your climate message to our young audience watching, and what maybe you tell your children they can do to have an impact and transition to a low carbon resilient future?
Well, first of all, my children tell me.
Okay.
Okay. My son studies marine biology. He works on coral reefs. He's trying to that's his mission, is really to revive coral reefs. My daughter has been a vegetarian since she's 11 years old, and she's been trying to convince her parents since then to go down that route with a climate vision behind it. And I think that generation, the millennials, are much more advanced in all of that than generations that have come before. So we have a lot to learn really from our children. But what would I say about climate change to that generation? It is that it's kind of the right thing to do. It is one of the most exciting areas to be in nowadays, because it is so important. It's a moral imperative, but it is also an area of great opportunity in which technologies are being developed, new things are being tried out. There's a huge focus by all of humanity really on this space. It is something where things move, where with vision you can achieve things, and therefore for anyone that age, it's a great area to be in and to contribute.
Thank you so much, Hans-Peter. It was really fantastic to have you here with us today. This is live from Vienna, IFC Climate Business Forum, Climate Solutions. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia.